Welcome and thank you everybody for joining the New Nature Artist Talk conversation with Nerea Calvillo and Nick Shapiro. My name is Tatjana Braun. I'm program curator at the Goethe-Institut Montreal. The conversation today is part of our public program of New Nature, a series of encounters between leading climate scientists, artists, and technologists from Canada, Germany, Mexico, and the United States, working with immersive media. Over the course of the next month, we are continuing this exchange by presenting a range of programs such as discussions, film screenings, studio visits, etc. So if you want to follow the conversation, don't forget to regularly check our website and social channels for upcoming programs, or follow just the hashtag NewNature2020. New Nature is an initiative by the Goethe-Institut. It's realized with the support of the Federal Foreign Office of Germany and in collaboration with different international organizations. And I would like to take this opportunity now to thank all our partners for their involvement and creative inputs, namely National Film Board, Interactive Studio here in Montreal, the Milieu Institute at Concordia University also in Montreal, Retune, Creative Technology Platform in Berlin, XR Hub in Bavaria, Massive Science, the Phi Center, the Museum of the Moving Image in New York City, and Union Docs, who are providing the technical support for this event. And now I'm very happy to hand over to the New Nature Principal Curator, Canadian documentary filmmaker and independent curator, Samara Chadwick, who will give a brief introduction to the program and most importantly, present our wonderful speakers. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Tatjana. And I also want to thank Juan Pedro, who's in the background making all of this happen virtually. So thank you all for being here. Also to our public. I'm coming to you from rural Nova Scotia, which is on ancestral Mi'kmaq territory. And as a form of land acknowledgement, I invite you all to check out nativeland.ca, which is a beautiful resource to learn more about not only the traditional peoples of the land where you're calling in from today, but also the treaties and languages that are spoken in that territory. We'll also just go through quickly the Q&A protocol, because we really invite you to join the conversation. There are two ways to ask questions. One is to input questions in the Q&A tab, which is in the bottom right of your screen. You can type up your questions and we'll be feeding them to Nick, who will be moderating the conversation. You can also raise your hand and we're going to try to come around to you, and then we'll unmute you and you'll be able to use your own voice to ask a question. So we'll be testing that out today. This whole project is an evolving kind of organism that began with the idea of bringing together people who don't normally intersect, and whose practices are in themselves very multidisciplinary in terms of engaging with climate in new ways, in public-facing ways, in immersive ways, utilizing new technologies to ask new questions or propose new avenues for intersecting with our lived environments, and also just the people and the ideas within our lived environments. So this artist talk is highlighting a lot of the qualities that we have been kind of culling in our different spaces. There's going to be a lot to unpack in this hour, and so I won't take any more time, but I will quickly introduce Nick Shapiro, who is not only moderating, but will also be talking about his work, which is also really essential, and he's also participating in our project as an integral role. So Nick is a multidisciplinary environmental researcher who studies and designs interventions into issues of chemical contamination, climate change, and mass incarceration. He's worked on tracking the quasi-legal legal resale of 120,000 chemically contaminated FEMA trailers after Hurricane Katrina, developing air monitoring systems that were distributed into the communities, and as well as communities impacted by fracking, and testing fossil fuel-free means of long-distance air travel, which is part of the Aeroscene project. His current projects include studying the efficacy of microbiome impacts of a low-cost bio-phyto-air mediation system, in supporting environmental research on toxic living conditions within carceral institutions. He's also finishing a book about toxic homes, climate change, settler colonialism, and the desire for a radically different future, which is provisionally entitled Homesick. He also was a co-founder of EDGI, the Environmental Data and Governments Initiative, in 2016, and he's an assistant professor of biology and society at UCLA. Thanks for being here, Nick, and thank you, Nerea, as well.
Thank you so much, Samara. I've long admired your the care and thought with which you bring people together, and you do it in a way that sticks, and that's so unique. And it's an honor to be here, and I've already learned so much from all of the participants in this workshop. So I would like to start by acknowledging the Tongva people as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar. That's also the land that's known as Los Angeles and the South Channel Islands. UCLA, where I'm sitting now, is what is known in the US as a land grant institution. And what that means is that the federal government dispossessed indigenous people through violence-backed land cessions, and then gave that land to universities to sell. And then with the profits from that sale, those profits went into their endowment. So as a land grant institution, it's not just that we're sitting on unceded indigenous land, but also the finance that goes into this lab and the endowment of this university is directly tied to indigenous dispossession. So, is with that history in mind, that as a professor at a land grant institution, I pay my respects to the Honukvitan ancestors, Ahihirom elders, Eyohinkem, our relatives and relations, and those past, present, and emerging. So, it is with great pleasure that I'm here to host us for the next hour to steep in the work and the insights of Nerea Calvillo. She is a thoroughly multidisciplinary architect and researcher. She runs the office C+arquitectos, where she literally builds with air. Here's some of her work that you might see later. She also helped train the next generation of critical practitioners as an associate professor at the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies at the University of Warwick. She's also known to summer in New York City, where she runs a studio at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture. And she reflects critically upon data, sensing devices, feminist technologies, and how to endure perpetual toxicity, also as a science and technology scholar. So not only building and teaching and training, but also critically analyzing. Her work is regularly exhibited, including a recent exhibition at the Royal Academy of Art in the UK for an exhibition entitled Eco-Visionaries, and that just closed. Her research on caustic urban atmospheres includes the usual suspects of particulate matter and toxic gases. You can see some of the depictions here that we'll get further into in just a second. But she also transcends the fetishization of these human-made toxicants to explore the more mundane pollutant of pollen. So we'll talk about that as well. Personally, I've learned so much from Nerea over the last 6 or 7 years of knowing her. She has really helped me loosen my white knuckle grip on the idea that environmental change can only happen through having the best data. She's really questioned some of my assumptions about how that relay between data, knowledge, and action happens. She's absolutely unique in her ability to move so much good work while also knowing when to pump the brakes, when to slow down and to think critically about the decisions that others have made and that she would be making in creative processes. She also has the energy that we all need to survive this ongoing Zoominar that is the present moment. So without further ado, I'd like to bring on Nerea.
First of all, thanks a lot, Nick, for this amazing and spectacular multimedia presentation and for your amazingly kind words. It's a total pleasure to be discussing, even if it's in public, but maybe that's also good, that we can expand our conversations with more views. And I'll speak a little bit, maybe through the presentation, how our conversations have been absolutely fundamental for my work and for my approach to toxicity and actually data, because you've very often just pulled me back to the data sometimes, which was very needed. But first of all, I'd like to thank Samara for the invitation, Tatiana, Katia, and Pedro Juan for all the amazing organization of the event, and also to say hi to the participants whom I haven't met yet, but it's an amazing group of people. So congratulations to everyone for having put all this together. I checked the land dispossession, and I live in the UK. I'm from Spain, so two centers of empire, and unfortunately we don't have that tradition yet, so there's a lot of work that we need to do on this side of the ocean. But thank you for reminding us that we need to do that very, very soon. So I think without further ado, I'm going to start the presentation, if that's okay. And please feel free to interrupt at any time and see if we can have this as a fluid conversation. Can you see my screen, Nick? Perfect. Okay, so I leave you under the air of Madrid. This was a project, an iteration of the project in the air that I initiated in 2008, and it's been an ongoing exploration done and conducted in many different instances with amazing groups of collaborators. And this is really important because there's been input from lots and lots of people. And in this iteration, this last one, it was a commission for the Real Academy where we were asked to try to communicate in the air in an easier way. And we explored how to bring the ideas that were fundamental to in the air, which were to spatialize air pollution, to specify what it is, to specify the components, to understand their performance, not only as a curiosity or as a artistic project, but more than anything, to start understanding seriously the materiality of the air. And as an architect, to start thinking how to engage with it. And then I realized very soon that it was also a matter of how we imagine it and think about it. And it started from an interest, probably ongoing, on what we have left out of knowledge, of our practices, our disciplines, what we don't talk about, what goes under discussed, what's not accounted for, and what's invisible. And back then in 2008, the air was not in the news as it is now. And I started wondering, like, why do we never speak about it as designers and spatial designers? Like, why have I never thought about the air outdoors in the public space? So starting to think about how to not only understand the air in relation to the city, but also how to see the air within the city, and whether that transformed not only the ways in which we engage with pollution, but also the ways in which we navigate the city might relate to each other and so forth. And now with COVID, we've seen that this becomes like crucial and has had critical consequences on how we not only communicate with ourselves, but also how we inhabit urban spaces. So I started thinking about this project, as all these projects, as data visualizations, because I was really interested in using or exploring the complexity that data sets and data feeds allowed us to make visible, to understand. But then, and I think this is something that we'll discuss later with Nick, the idea that when do we need data? When do we only have to understand what's going on? When do we need narratives, as we saw yesterday, or storytelling to conceptualize different issues a long time? So started to challenging this notion of data visualization and thinking about how the visualizations themselves can also become environmental mediation. So they not only make visible, if that was even possible, but also how the visualizations can not only create new narratives about the air, but also might transform urban spaces in this case. So for the Seoul Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism in 2017, we were commissioned to do something on the air, and if it was related to Seoul, the better. So in this interest of specifying and understanding that particulate matter, particles floating in the air, gases, are not only chemicals, living entities and so forth, but they're also cultural and political. Very soon we realized that in Seoul, they have these storms that are called yellow dust, but they're highly politicized, and the media and the government uses them for basically delegating the responsibilities and throwing them back to China and Mongolia as the constitution of pollution as the other that invades us, but we don't have any responsibility. So what if by making visible particulate matter in the air when there's no yellow dust storms, how would that eventually have an effect in how locals and people in general understood and imagined air pollution? So we decided, as these processes are always like really, really quick, we decided to work on and explore the capacities of a prototype that we had developed in Media Prado in the very first iteration of the project in 2008, adding more parameters to the project, trying to explore what if we can make visible the air that we're measuring right there at the time. What if instead of showing numbers, we use intensities to move away the interest or the obsession from the quantities and the numbers and the precision, and moving towards a more gradual experiential way of understanding data and also inhabiting it eventually. And considering as well that these might become, or how could we think about these visualizations as infrastructures that can also condition public spaces? So in this case, it was water vapor. So what were the opportunities of using water vapor in public spaces to cool it down, to bring more humidity and so forth? Also considering that it needed to be open source. We wanted it to be as cheap as possible, which has consequences on the quality of the data or the precision of the data, I would say. And understanding that suddenly our work as architects was designing board systems and drawing them as if they were the plans and sections of the project, because we didn't have plans and sections other than these. So how working with air and thinking with air and trying to explore the capacities of the air itself to make itself visible, literally situating everything, the data, the visualization within the air, produce different types of engagements with air pollution. And it was pretty interesting to see how people were engaging in many different ways that were unexpected, but some others proved in a way or gave us indications that the numbers are not necessarily the only way of engaging and getting to know air pollution. We developed a similar idea through the office, C+arquitectos, for a project that was commissioned. I mean, it was an open call by the Madrid City Council to intervene in abandoned spaces in the periphery of the city. So we applied for this site, which had this empty pond that had been empty for 7 years or so. It was a project that required co-design with the neighbors. And very soon they started speaking about how water had been part of the history, of the memories, of the landscape, and also of the politics of that specific neighborhood. So we decided to bring water in, and it was not only a metaphoric user experience desire. It was also an intention to think what it means to bring a natural resource, a natural element that used to be there but is not there anymore. Also inspired by one of the participants, a teenager to whom we asked, well, where does water come from, the one that we drink in Madrid? And she said, from the sea. And the sea is like 400 kilometers away. So we have lost total contact where with what the minimum elements that we have around come from eventually. So how to bring them in, not only as a pedagogical project, but also as an experiential one that understands that there might be many different ways in which this can happen. So we decided to have 4 different layers that refer to different ways in which the neighbors, with all the problems that participatory design and construction, as you'll see, have and carry with them. But understanding that what if we can start speaking about the dams in the mountains and to start getting information about the quantity of water that is in the dams, and when there's droughts, which is very often in summer in Madrid, where the whole installation turns off, so that the data changes the behavior and the possibilities of use of the space. Also, how by bringing the pollution of the river that brings the water closer to Madrid allowed us to bring also the memories of some of the older neighbors that accounted how they spend the summers, like swimming in the old river that used to go through the site, and how to inhabit basically Again, this place that was not talked about, not discussed, that it was like something there that it was not even considered as an opportunity, and we decided to transform it into a public space. I won't go into the detail, but each of these layers required a different conversation. The leaks that had taken place, instead of removing them or trying to hide them, we tried to emphasize them, speaking about the leaks of capitalism, but how just by making visible the leaks, then suddenly kids play differently in the public space. And all these, again, with minimum resources. This was a 10,000 euro budget project. So everything with minimum resources, but thinking how through minimum activations and minimum interventions as well, we could transform the ways in which people could think about water in many different ways, and also to their everyday life, basically. But as Nick mentioned at the beginning, I've also been, I started looking at pollution because it was the only data that was available about the air. And when looking about what happened with pollen, then suddenly that's a completely different beast in terms of data collection. So that stayed on the side for a while, but then I went back thinking, well, what does pollen tell us that pollution doesn't? And then suddenly it opens a completely different understanding of what the air is, because pollen is the space of reproduction, plant worlds, multi-species with insects, and all sorts of trees that reproduce through the air. So it started bringing a new layer that was completely shut down when we think about the air only as a pollution container, basically. And through a project at the CCA, I went to research in the archives how, when pollen started being considered as a pollutant, it had massive transformations in US cities. So ragweed was removed from empty lots. Literally, people were killing nature in order to prevent asthma. But also it transformed how we thought about interior spaces, because filters started being put in place, and therefore the distinction between the inside and the outside started becoming even clearer in relation to the air and air conditioning. But also all the practices that substituted the protection of spaces to the protection of the body. And then all the medical, from pills to powders to, I mean, they were doing crazy things at the time. And how all these also affected urban spaces, and how empty lots were the battlefields of class, race, very often gender, and plant and air conditions. But then, as I said, I have like this love affair with pollen that is never fulfilled. So in a collaboration for a small film that this art asked us to produce, this asked us to produce a project in collaboration with Jacob Horowitz Goodman, who's a film director who works on AI. So I sent him the first ideas about pollen, a script on pollen, and he came back with dust. And this project, I'm going to show a little excerpt, but it made really clear the tension that exists when we switch or with the lenses that we look at, particulate and gases in the air. If we look at it from the pollution perspective, from the dangerous perspective, then you get one argument. And if you look at it from a more reproductive perspective, or more lively, if you will, approach, then you get a completely different thing. So this ended up being like a kind of very difficult, but also interesting agreement. And I'll show you the video.
This is an audio-visual transmission from data center 4527R on Earth. We're sending out yet another SOS to any humans within range of the planet. We don't know if you can still receive these messages or if you care, but if you can, and if you do, please, we need your help.
You want to know what we did 16,803 minutes ago?
So you can check not only this video, but all his videos early stage, because they're really, really interesting on how, if we think about AI as something that is living with us, how that changes also our understanding of technology and the future very often. So these last really, really, really short videos are work in progress, literally, because I really don't know what to do with them. But the confinement has made us think about the differences between pollution, toxicity, what's at stake, how do we imagine our cohabitation with these invisible particles and so forth. So it's very short, 3 pieces. This one is called 2 years, 3 months, and 2 days. "46 days of confinement. Two minutes, 30 seconds. That's it. So in order to have a proper conversation, I think it would be really, really great, Nick, if you showed us some of your work so that we can be all on the same page. I'll stop sharing.
So I thank you, Nerea, first. It's strange that there's so much work of yours that I haven't seen yet, so it's great to actually catch up in public with everyone. I think, and this is me being a weasel, I think we don't have time for me to present. I'm pretty sure we don't. Because we're going to talk a little bit and we're going to have some questions, and we only have till the top of the hour. So this is me weaseling out. Until a later date, I will share some work. But first, I have
very briefly
a quick
one.
I'm getting
please.
All right. Okay. All right. I'll do it very quick. The messages coming over chat were insistent, so I'll do it quickly. So as Samara talked about, I'll talk about the inroads to all of this work and thinking about the air, and also I'll talk about 2 experiments that are very different, almost antithetical. Let's see. So my work began in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. I was studying the FEMA trailers, which are these trailers you see on the right side of your screen, produced in mass to house those dispossessed after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita along the Gulf Coast in 2005. They were really quickly built on no-bid contracts, and they were soon found to harbor elevated levels of formaldehyde, which is an irritant, an allergen, a neurotoxin, and a known human carcinogen. And so as I started doing this work on the FEMA trailers, the hurricane recovery was going on, and the federal government took them back, these trailers back, and they quasi-legally resold them across the country. So I tracked the quasi-legal resale of these contaminated housing units across the country as they were donated to native nations, as they wound their way to the fracking fields of North Dakota, as they went to the hotspots of the foreclosure crisis, because this was the resale happened in 2010, sort of the apex of the housing crisis in the US. And as I began studying this issue, I came to understand how these FEMA trailers were not just sort of an anomalous aberration in because of bad post-disaster management, but really the formaldehyde issues in the engineered woods of these trailers were just a hyper condensed part of a larger petrochemical issue of the toxic home. So the formaldehyde holds together the different planes of engineered woods. And even in the state of California, which I'm in now, which is thought to be an environmental leader in this country, 98% of new homes have enough formaldehyde in the atmosphere to make you irritated at the very least. 98%. And so I tried to think about how we could achieve change for such a large project as low-cost housing. You know, they have access to low-cost housing because of these trailers, but also they're getting toxic. They're getting exposed to toxic exposures. And let's see. Actually, I'm gonna go the other direction. So one of the first things that we tried to do was think about how remediation could happen in these spaces. And so I looked through the research that NASA did on these homes that were supposed to be the mobile homes for the future colonization of the cosmos, basically the trailers of Mars, and then design some remediation systems based off of this early NASA research. I won't go into why, like, all of the marketing that you see at your local plant store that says this one plant is going to clean your air. I'm not going to explain why that's wrong, but it is wrong, and it needs some augmentation and alteration of the ecosystem, the substrate, and the way that air moves through the root systems. It's really the microbes in the roots that do the metabolizing of toxicants. Moving fast, sorry. And so I've been working on this for years, 5 years. We found in this first test, the image on the right is a mobile home in Picayune, Mississippi, which is actually the site of the NASA space station where they first did the research on plant remediation. And that's where there was a FEMA trailer that, these emergency response trailers that were contaminated, and we had a 40% reduction rate with that first prototype. Another cancer cluster in Georgia requested access to this, and we did another experiment there and found an 84% reduction. But we're really terrified that we might be trading toxicants, these like industrial compounds that are seeping from the walls of your home with exposures like fungi. So really encountering some similar tensions that Nerea is talking about. So we've done some preliminary microbiome analysis with the amazing Karen Dannemiller at Ohio State University. And we found that in our preliminary tests, there's actually remarkably a decrease in fungi. So we're hopeful. It's also just terrifying to be trying to sell solutions. So we can maybe talk about that later if we want. Terrifying. Now going backwards into the future, which is this project that is led by Tomás Saraceno, this Argentine artist, and based in Berlin. I've been collaborating with for the last 5 years or so. This is a launch that I led as part of the Antarctic Biennale in Antarctica above the Argentine Research Station. And what the AirScene project is it's trying to imagine a true alternative in this quasi-plausible future. So if I'm remediating with the plant in the immediate term at a really small scale, like one house at a time, what the AirScene is trying to do is imagine a future where we have a very different relationship with the environment. And this is a way of the AirScene, these solar balloons that are heated just with the sun and move with the wind, and they require no fossil fuels. And if you don't have fossil fuels, then you don't have the mass extraction of oil and methane is how you get formaldehyde. So all this oil extraction, hydrocarbon extraction, is subsidizing the issue of formaldehyde in people's homes. They're integrally connected. This domestic and intimate toxic exposure and global climate change issues And the Aero scene is trying to imagine a quasi-plausible future where we don't need to be producing the unquantifiable amount of particulate matter that goes into flying across the Atlantic. And so you may see these balloons. This is sort of like a flattened 3D image, 360 image. You may see these balloons and think it's sort of this like flight of fancy. And you just sort of go like a scattered seed wherever the wind takes you. But what we've been doing with the Earth Atmospheric and Planetary Science Department at MIT is to map the air in 3D. So you could imagine this yellow is the wind going one way, and this blue is the wind going the other direction at a different altitude. And you can control your altitude with the balloon. And so you can catch the wind at different altitudes to go where you want, and you sort of weave it together in this sort of what I call is like a calculated submission. How can you use big data, but also have a very different relationship with the environment that is not always about overcoming and interrupting the environment? And so it's this, it's a very different sort of form of subjectivity. So that's sort of this quasi-plausible future, and this tool for remediation in the present. They're sort of incompatible a little bit with each other. You know, I can't hold hostage the people that I know that are facing toxic exposure, can't hold them hostage to an alternative future at the same time as I know that we're not going to be able to reform our way out of this system by just optimizing a terrible set of relationships. So that's it's a crash course in some things that I've been thinking about, and I would like to ask some questions of you, Nerea, if I may. I think that I want to start with a very simple question. Are metaphors shit?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, yeah.
This is good. This is going well.
Sorry. Shall I expand or shall we continue?
Jeez, yeah.
No, let's continue because I'm.
Expand. No, what do you mean?
No, that one of the challenges I would say that at least in design, and I would say that in many other fields, the relationship with the environment has been purely metaphorical. Like this looks like, this feels like, or this has been conceptualized as X. And this with the air is very clear, like air as emptiness, as a void, as all these deep philosophical conceptualizations. But as Lucy Gray said, well, actually that's just one way of saying it because we have forgotten its materiality. So I try to be very careful, but at the same time, they can be very generative as tools to think about something, as speculative devices, if you will, but not per se as metaphors.
Okay.
Yeah,
that is helpful. Sorry for the trap of a question. That actually leads me into thinking about the prototype and sort of some of the attention that I see in your work. Is that the prototype sort of occupies this dual space of both a necessity and a fantasy. And so what I mean by that is that you've written about neoliberal testbed urbanism, about the sort of perpetual promise of the city that is always in a state of not yet being ready. But at the same time, I also see a mandate in your work to begin prototyping different ways of relating to each other and the environment. And we can't wait for those alternative futures to be fully baked or polished before we start enacting them. So how do you parse these kinds of prototyping that you invest hope into? The ones that you see are invitations to worlds that you'd like to cultivate.
I would respond with some of the comments that you've made on your own work, because for me there's several challenges. The first one is, when do we make very clear when something is a prototype? because one of the things that we encountered with the testbed urbanism, which was a collective project with Orit Halpern and Nirea Calvillo and others, we realized that in smart cities, basically no one says that this is a prototype, they just like rule it out. And whether people acknowledge that, and we are seeing that with pharmaceuticals. So this is a neoliberal capitalism. Let's just have the users as testers at the same time. But then on the other hand, we need to test alternative futures, and we can only do that through prototypes, I would say. Whether we call them prototypes or whether we call them experiments, explorations. So I think it's a matter of being very clear what the aim is in each instance, and what are the responsibilities that are established, what are the processes of evaluation, and so forth. But in the same way, as you said, well, the plans are prototypes, if you will, to see what is the relationship between plants and indoors air. But we cannot put them as solutions because we don't know yet. And actually that might not solve the problem. So prototyping also in a wide range of possible futures or levels of speculation, if you will, from the very basic that we just need to test what happens to the errors in project. It's a really challenging one because it can get, and we've seen that with all the neoliberal language, that it gets capitalized immediately. So how to retain those concepts as productive ones to think about alternative futures?
Thank you. I think I want to also just talk about another tension that I see, and that is sort of revolving around sensors and sense making. So there's been such a scramble for these low-cost sensors in recent years. There's been a triumphing of these technologies as sort of a democratization of science, and as potential tools for advancing environmental justice through community science. These celebrated devices are also sometimes regarded basically as tools of divination, as Christian Nold has sort of found, where they produce sort of near random data. So like the Shinyai sensor that I saw in your image was then like outmoded in like a huge switch to the plant tower purple air sensor, in this like dramatic shift of technology. So as someone who's worked so intensely with these sensors that are promising different technocratic futures for cities across the globe, can you sort of walk us through the tensions at play in the deployment of these devices?
That's a great question. I would respond in a similar way as in the previous question. Like it depends on what is the objective of the project and what is the main aim politically, socially. What do we want to do, and what do we need, and what do we actually need? Because I agree that there's been lots of enthusiasm on developing sensors as if they were the way of solving air pollution. But again, when looking at the resolution of the data, and well, scientists say, well, we cannot use that data, therefore there's no conversation possible. But then I think if we ask, well, which kind of data do we need? Do we really need data? And what happens when we're using only data gathered through technological devices as the only way of getting to know, encountering, and also evidencing situations of toxic violence, environmental injustice, and so forth. So for some environmental justice projects, data might be absolutely crucial because there might not be data. And I think the work that you did, for instance, with the chemtrail is like, no one measures formaldehyde indoors. Like there's no sensors that, in general, like there's no monitoring, if you will, constant monitoring of lots of conditions. We actually monitor just like 5, 10 pollutants in relation to the air. So when do we need the data so that the data can be mobilized politically as a form of evidence, but also understanding that our bodies, some human bodies sense their plants and animals do so. What are the challenges of using biosensors, again, ethically? Same question that you asked with the plants, like what are the ethics of using other entities to sense for us? But also, there's been explorations, and Christian Old, I think, is a very good example on how to use sensors, cheap sensors, as sense makers, basically to start getting an understanding of the complexity of the sensing process itself, to demystify technology as the solution, and to start having discussions. So probably sensing as a prop, a sensor as a prop to start discussing. And the Paulos and in human-computer interactions, for instance, I love their work because they say, well, you're not, for certain questions like what do we need to measure? We don't need sensors. We just need to have that conversation, which might be more important than how much. So to move the question, for me, it has been really, really important to move the question from the how much to qualitative conditions of pollution, because we only focus on data, then the qualitative is left out inevitably.
And so I want to switch from this question of the technology, the device, and the data to the medium. So we have a question from Sarah Lisa Vogel on trying to understand, maybe in terms of utility, which is the medium, as someone that works across multiple mediums, is the virtual, sort of the VR world, and the Insight installation. They scale very differently. They impact people very differently. If you could walk us through just your experience, your situated particular understanding of the different utility of the in-person installations and the virtual.
Well, that's really, really important, because one of the things that I started wondering at the very beginning was why do we always see the data from a web page, and what happens with the digital divide, and what happens when we are outdoors, when the smartphones were maybe not as common as they are, and what does it mean to be looking at something like that? No, what are those, and starting the exploration in thinking together, what exactly do we want to know? What do we want it for? And therefore, what is the best medium, let's say, to think about that? Not only to make it visible for others, but also for us to explore certain medium. This came from a kind of intuitive, if you will, experiment, because at the beginning it was an experiment with a diffuse facade that I showed before yellow dust, which was, well, what if you bring the data to the public space and there's no numbers? How do people react? Like, is that going to, and at that time I was thinking there's going to be a parliament of things where people are going to have debates about air pollution. Of course, that doesn't happen like that. Politics is way more complex, and public spaces as well. But still, they provide a completely different engagement. And this is something that I've been trying to explore, or at least test, also with Emma Garnett, as paying attention to what people do in response to the different medium. And we cannot think about visualizations or anything in general without thinking about it as an object, let's say, in the world, and whether something is going to be used in common, in private, this close, that close. And it's not only a design issue, it's a research, ethical, and political issue, I would say.
And
sorry, just to say that you've been it's interesting because you've been doing something similar, although in even more diverse context, because I really liked how you were threading through formaldehyde, through methane, and the aerosine, and it's experimenting how the format itself requires different scales of conceptualization of what you're doing. Like if you're thinking about formaldehyde as methane, as large scales, you get to climate change. But if you look at it here, then you have to maneuver in different, and each of them gives you a different understanding of formaldehyde and climate change. And I think that's the power and the beauty of exploring different formats, that each of them gives you other understandings and other information about whatever you're looking at.
Yeah. So the answer is yes.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, I mean,
I should, like, I'm gonna do like that from now on.
Yeah, the double yes. I think these sort of the fallacy of having to choose and knowing that certain interventions are speaking not only to different people but different temporalities, and that's sort of what I was trying to gesture towards in terms of like the unknown future that's probably not going to happen with the air scene, and like the tomorrow that might be a little bit better.
Yeah. Just to mention very briefly that it's also a rejection of a technocratic approach of the best and the most efficient visualization, which is something that happens a lot in engineering. Like, what is the most efficient? What is the best? And it's always, well, it depends what for, and that's crucial as well.
Yeah,
sorry.
It actually really, like, it's a great transition to this question by Desiree Forrester that is asking exactly about the slipperiness of aesthetics, trying to understand, you know, how you can make information, data, feelings, affects digestible through these visualizations, while also building in a resistance to these neo-capitalist ideals.
Thank you, Desiree. That's a great question. What I've realized is that it's very difficult. It's impossible to predict what people are going to do with what we do, basically. No matter how much we intend to anticipate and communicate, if you will, or try to put one topic on the table, it's always so. What was very interesting with Yellow Dust was that some of the visitors, for them, the cloud was, because it represented pollution, they thought that A, it was toxic, and B, that it was bad. So they disliked it. They tried to run away, created a really like aggressive, if you will, subjectivity, like, I don't know why this is here, and I don't know how they can put something toxic on a public space. So, and then other people thought, well, this is just humidity and it's really nice, so therefore I don't give a damn what it is about. And some other people, but it was also an entry point for many people through aesthetics and through an experiential situation that entered first because they got attracted, if you will, by the cloud, and then they started thinking, but what on earth is this, and why are we looking at this? And then there was a slower interaction or engagement, and very often it was dual, because people were enjoying down underneath the cloud, but then when they knew that it was pollution, then they ran away like and it was water vapor. So I think it's impossible to predict, but it's a tool, and some other things we anticipated and they happened, but then some others just emerged, of course. And that's why in the second project in Los Descensos in Madrid, we really want to do something on a like real public space, because a public space is like a much more complicated environment, and the notion of aesthetics then gets way more complicated because the public is, of course, as complex and heterogeneous as it is in a city. But I haven't figured it out yet, so maybe you can help.
Maybe, but unlikely. I think just 2 quick notes, and I think we're got 5 minutes over. I feel the digital long hook came
Okay.
coming to the screen. 2 opposing ideas is that in the remediation system, we're sort of in this space of quasi-appropriation already. We're basically toying with consumer irony. You know, we're making like a flat pack remediation system that you can buy with your flat pack furniture that's going to be emitting formaldehyde. So we're in this we're in the churn, and I don't know if we're going to sell it. I'm still wanting to do more thorough safety work, and there's ethics in that. People want them now. You know, like the same issues that went through like HIV medicine, antiretroviral trials. Like we're already in danger. It's worth the risk to try to remediate. And the other side, I do think, I think it's important, like in the Aero scene has taught me about thinking about different kinds of narratives, not just the sort of tragedy and this farce, and like evincing harm as the way to get out of this problem, like more charismatically talking about harm, but power of seduction narratives. And that's kind of how we got into this pickle, to put it in a bizarrely
nice way.
Yeah, exactly.
Desirable way.
Yeah, I don't know where that came from, but that's what I said. And so yeah, I think that maybe where we can end is just thinking about, is there a possibility to leverage these media to create seduction narratives into different modes of relating with each other and with the environment, and interrupting some of the longer legacies of colonialism and industrialism that have been conditioning our bodies, lands, and atmospheres. So I think with that, I think Samara might hop in. There she is.
Just to say thank you. Yeah, thank you both, Nerea and Nick, for sparking some really interesting thoughts. And thank you all for being present. This talk was recorded and will be posted on Facebook. Speaking of interrupting capitalistic narratives, we're utilizing their platforms to send out these seduction narratives. Yet another act of pickled fermentation. But so this talk will be on Facebook Live, and as well as yesterday's talk with Leanne Bidasa Simpson, which is also on the Goethe-Institut Montreal Facebook. Nerea and Nick, I'm so glad you're taking time to then go backstage with New Nature participants. So we'll send you the link to join us in a moment. Thank you to Union Dogs, and especially to Juan Pedro, who's just been running this whole online experience. And thanks to the Goethe-Institut, of course. Bye-bye, everyone.